Hi there, thanks for joining today. We're going to be chatting with Rebekah Baze from CIC Consulting Group. Rebekah has chatted with us before. She's a wealth of knowledge for everything that has to do with condominiums, HOAs. She's a consultant for buyers, sellers, as well as developers and individual HOAs board members to kind of keep them on track on what they need to be looking for and doing when kind of managing an HOA. Today, specifically, reserve studies is the topic. We're going to talk about what are reserve studies and kind of unraveling the different reserve study models. There's a lot of different companies that put together the studies. We're going to also talk about common hurdles when you're looking at a reserve study from the buyer perspective, and then also from a current homeowner perspective too. You're looking to the future, how much, especially now this time of year, which is usually in the fall, a lot of homeowners associations are looking to prepare their budgets for the following year, and looking at the reserve studies is a key component in setting increased HOA dues or different projects that are going to be happening in that following year. So it's really important for all homeowners to be aware of what a reserve study is, and you'll definitely find this very informative. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out. Happy to help, and hope you're all doing well. Thank you. I always say thank you a million times to you, because you just truly save the day in a lot of different ways, especially when it comes to condos, and just your knowledge, I think, is just completely unmatched to anyone else that I've ever met. From the foundation, I guess, of condominiums, and then also kind of the working parts and operating parts of them. And I do think that when you're a buyer or seller and you go through the process as a buyer, having, you're working with your agent, they're knowledgeable about condominiums, but to have a consultant like you to kind of lean on for, going through the documents and bringing out red flags, or, just kind of discussing actually the positive attributes of a community. I feel like you do a really good job touching on all of those. And then also, consulting with, different homeowners that actually already purchased and are just kind of wondering, if their HOAs are doing the thing, or the homeowner association are doing the things that they should be doing, and goals for the future of certain communities, and the things that how they should be setting themselves up now. And I think that kind of segues into our conversation today about reserve studies, because those are kind of foundational piece that homeowners or homeowner associations and boards need to know, because you're planning for the future. You have your budget, and you have these depreciated asset basically, and you need to know how much money to allocate for the future, so you can kind of minimize risk of special assessments. So that's, I guess, how I look at it, but I would love you to dive in and just kind of maybe start with baseline of like, what the heck is a reserve study?
Yeah, you got it. You hit the high points, and thank you for having me. As always, pleasure to talk with you. Reserve studies are really important, not only to associations to help guide them through their budgeting and renewal and remediation activities, but also to tell a buyer what's coming. What are you buying? Mm-hmm. So I view reserve studies as one of the key components of any kind of resale package. And one of the key reasons you want a good one is so that you can tell a buyer why you should pay as much as we're asking you to pay for this unit. So I view it as definitely one of the key pieces of any kind of resale document package, is telling a buyer what's coming, are we on track, and what will you have to pay for when you purchase into this community.
There's these studies that are put together by multiple different companies out there. So I guess the question when it says, okay, well, how is a building funded? That's like the number one key marker that I think a lot of agents use and buyers use. Can you explain, I guess, how that, what is that metrics, or what is that number?
It's one of the most frustrating aspects I find, is every reserve study gives a percent funded number. And the percent funded is interpreted by most people who don't really understand it as it's good or bad, right? So the percent funded is actually a measure of depreciation. So an example to illustrate percent funded would be, let's say you have a roof that's a 10-year roof, and it's going to cost $100,000 at year 10. If at year 1, you're putting aside $20,000, you're 100% funded. You're funding the full depreciated value of that component. If you get to year 5 and you have 50 grand, you're 100% funded. If you have 25, you're 50%. So that helps illustrate how you can get to a $100,000 roof project. You can have $75,000 in your account and be 75% funded, which is a really high number, but you still need a special assessment to do the work because of the timing. So what I find that one of the biggest issues with percent funded is people don't understand that it has no relationship to when those expenses show up. So you can be 80% funded and need a special assessment. You could be 4% funded and you don't need a special assessment. So it relates to depreciation and timing more so than just the number itself, which is a really frustrating way to try to evaluate it.
Yeah. So when you're going over an analysis, then do you even really look at that number first, or are you just kind of diving into the details?
Well, I absolutely look at it to see, well, what are they saying?
Yeah.
Another really critical piece to that is we also have to remember that the reserve study is a point in time document. And many reserve studies prepare in advance for next year. I've looked at reserve studies that were created in February of 2023 for next year's recommendations. So it's 8 months old by the time we look at their actual assumptions versus what did the association do and what will they do. So point in time is a really important aspect of reserve studies. I absolutely look at the percent funded just to say, well, are we, what's the range? But I found that the more I dig into it, it becomes irrelevant. It isn't one of the major data points I talk to with buyers about. We barely talk about percent funded. I've also seen associations that are well funded in the middle of a special assessment to stay funded. I've seen associations that are low funded or underfunded, which never see a special assessment. Yeah. So it's a measure that everybody uses. I feel they use it incorrectly or not the way it really should be evaluated.
Gotcha. So with that, then there's some companies out there that kind of do different things within their reserve studies. What are you seeing out of those?
Oh, yes. Well, I guess a good analogy. Yeah, there are definitely different providers that do things differently, just like every other service in the land. Different brokers look at things differently. With reserve studies, where I see a big challenge in the difference between service providers is number one, level of detail in the study. I've seen reserve studies where the notes say the roof is one allowance. I've seen reserve studies where the roof category says we have this many square feet of this many materials, we're assuming this cost, we're adding sales tax or we're not. So there's a level of detail in how different reserve analysts evaluate the cost for different components. I think there are, maybe I've seen one, I know one for sure, maybe two reserve study providers that consistently factor in sales tax. So they're 10% more accurate than the ones that don't. And
there's maybe even like inflation too, right? So that like the worst case and best case.
And then and where the inflation factor shows up most is in current or old studies. If you did a reserve study for 2024 and you're preparing it now in November, it may be more accurate than the one prepared in February for the year 2024. So there can be variables even in the time in which that reserve study document is created because it makes assumptions. So if you get a reserve study for 2024, it's prepared in February, they assume the starting balance for your account will be, well, maybe between February and now we've spent money and now it's not. So that's one of the big things I plug in when I do, especially buyer evaluations, is what does the reserve study assume? And is that true today?
Gotcha. And then what is the Washington State requirement for reserve studies?
Washington State does require almost all. There's a few minor variables for which associations don't have to get a reserve study every year. But generally the rule is associations are supposed to get a reserve study every year. They're required to do an on-site evaluation every 3 years by a reserve study professional, and then an update in between. So
Gotcha.
most of those companies are offering a 3-year program. We come out once on site, we'll do your next 2 updates for a package price.
Gotcha. And are you seeing that the bulk of the condos out there are doing that?
I think post-COVID, it's picked up.
Yeah.
Pre-COVID and during COVID, there were some challenges. And then what I've also seen is a little bit of occasionally we don't want to get a new reserve study because we don't think we have any work to do. I did one the other day, and the reserve study provided was from 2020. Well, that reserve study said in the next 3 years, you have to do $5,000 worth of curb painting, something silly. So I can see why they didn't feel the need to update it. But the impact for that is if you have a 2020 reserve study, they're using 2020 numbers as assumption for cost.
Yep.
And we know that since 2020, costs have gone up, like for elevators, 30% in cost assumption. So sometimes those old reserve studies can be the biggest issue is the cost analysis. What does it really cost now versus when you got that study?
Yep. What are the, and I think we covered some of them, but what are the actual most important pieces of the reserve studies?
Well, first and foremost, I would say making sure the list of components that you're funding for is accurate. Some associations ask the reserve study provider to remove stuff. Let's take out windows because it looks better, or we interpret the documents to say windows are owner's responsibility. So they'll remove them. So number one would be making sure that the list of components is accurate. And that does take board and homeowner and people who live there, requires them to put some effort in. So really good reserve studies are collaborative. The reserve analyst who gets paid really not a ton of money to do these studies, which is one downside to state law. Now that we require it, we can't pay it, there's a different cost basis.
Yep.
But if the board is engaged with the reserve analyst, then the board can say, hey, you left off the spa filter, the spa heater that's not on the list. We know we have to replace it. Oh yeah, thank you. We missed it, and add it in. I feel it's really important for boards to be collaborative with reserve analysts to make sure that they're getting the right things on the list.
Yep.
At the same time, boards are volunteers. How do they know?
Yeah.
They don't know any better.
They don't. Yep. And that kind of goes again to our next topic is like, when you have these reserve studies and you're sitting down, this is a very timely time of year for us to be talking about this, because a lot of them are sitting down, boards are discussing their financials and budgets for 2024. So the proactive ones have already probably done it, but the ones that are, coming against the deadline are doing it now and trying to rush and get everything in. But how, when you have a board that's looking at their reserve studies and you have all these lists of things to do, how do they come up with the recommendations for how much to actually contribute towards reserves, given this 30-year trajectory?
Good question. The reserve study is supposed to give recommendations for that, and different states have different requirements on how they have to provide those recommendations. So for example, Oregon and Washington have really different recommendations on or obligations for what goes in the reserve study. Washington, you have to give baseline, full funding, and what the reserve analyst recommends. Oregon, it's basically a cash flow recommendation. They just tell you, what do you need to contribute every year to meet the need, which is a really different way to analyze it. Other states have no obligation and no requirements. So the reserve study is supposed to tell you, based on the age of all your components, roof, siding, windows, all the common elements, however old things are, and whatever the timeline is for replacement and the cost, we recommend you put aside this much every year so you don't have a special assessment.
Gotcha.
And they can either choose to follow that or not. Yep.
And depending on whether or not the data is correct, in the actual reserve study, it may be on or off. Just, as far as like how much you're putting in, you might be overfunding or you might be underfunding. It just really depends on the data that comes from the reserve study.
Absolutely. And what I found consistently more than overfunded
Mhm.
is somebody removed something or the reserve analyst didn't include something.
Mhm.
So I would say 90% of the time, if there's a problem with the 99% of the time, if there's a problem with the reserve study expectations or analysis or projections, it's something was missing
Got it.
or removed.
Are you seeing any in the current market that we're in right now, are you seeing any trends with regards to the reserve studies, like assumptions or projections or cost analysis trends
Yes,
people should watch
yes,
out
yes,
for?
yes. I've seen, and I read all the notes. So when I do these reviews, I read the notes within the studies to say, and a lot of the good studies tell you where those costs have changed or why those assumptions have moved. What I'm seeing consistently is things like elevators. They've gone up exponentially in cost from delays in components, from obsolescence, things don't exist anymore, from labor, from the consultant you need to help you with the elevator modernization. So I think reserve studies are starting to capture more of those long-term expenses that come just based on age. Just like with anything, if you have a classic Porsche, it's more expensive to do work. If you have an old building, it's more expensive to find those components anymore. And I think as we age, just as an infrastructure and just as a condos in general, it's becoming more and more important to rely on the reserve study to understand where might you run into some of those obsolescence issues. How old is the community? Do those parts exist anymore? And then with things like wood frame construction, not towers, not complex components, the key issue is just keeping up with the cost increases with inflation.
Yeah.
So I've looked at reserve studies that were 2 years old for communities that had similar style, age, size, and the cost difference between reserve studies that are current and those are significant. Things like painting, square footage, things like asphalt, all of those factor in. So the reserve study is one of those keys for associations to understand where's our risk of special assessment.
Yep. And as far as the association, what is their obligation to have to follow the reserve study? Like, is there a legal obligation or?
Yeah, no.
They can do whatever they want.
No. And I have a good analogy for that. When I talk to buyers, I use the analogy of a new car maintenance schedule. A reserve study is kind of similar to a vehicle maintenance schedule. Every so many miles, you replace this. Every, whatever usage, just like with the roof, at every 20 years, you replace the roof, unless you never do maintenance. So if your vehicle maintenance schedule says, renewal schedule says you need to replace your carburetor at 100,000 miles, but you never get an oil change or whatever, then you should probably do it sooner. And there's an impact there. So I use that analogy with, again, that you have to replace tires on your vehicle. Do you put aside money for it? No. Well, that's a special assessment when it shows up. Oh, now, so that helps with that concept. I see associations in various stages of head in the sand, or we can only do as much as we can do. I think the big impact on that strategy and approach is age. If a building is really old and really behind, you can only increase your assessment so much at a time to catch up.
Yep.
Newer buildings, if they have been consistently reasonable, they have more ability to absorb those and deal with whatever the reserve study adjustments are. So I think age of construction is a really big factor in how associations should look at their reserve funding and how those reserve studies impact them when they recommend you need to contribute 400 grand this year. And last year's budget included 60.
Yeah.
they're not going to increase to 400 next year. They're just not.
Yeah, I mean that, and then that's where, you know, you have the need for the special assessment to get certain things for the building up. And I guess it does come down to the mentality of the board and how, you know, every building is 100% different. The people that are running these buildings, you know, the HOA making the decisions, you know, they all have different experiences, whether no experience at all, or they have experiences in certain fields that kind of help, you know, progress these decisions to the right direction. But ultimately, the right direction is what's the right direction for the community. It's not something that's blanket to every single building.
And that's what it should be, right? But then you got humans. Yep. So if you have 5 board members and let's say 3 of them plan on selling next year, maybe they make decisions based on what's best for their sale next year, as opposed to if they're going to retire there.
Yep.
So it's different than a new car maintenance schedule because you've got a lot of people involved in your decision about your vehicle, right? And that's a big challenge. And I think the reserve study can capture a lot of those potential risks, challenges, and good things. I read a lot of reserve studies where I go to the meeting notes and I'm like, oh, great. They painted in 2020 before COVID. They were on track, as opposed to the one I looked at the day later that they were supposed to paint in 2019, and now it's going to cost them $500,000 more this year because they didn't do it.
Yep.
So the reserve study can really help you understand history in a way that affects you going forward. The details help with what do I have to pay for now going forward. Yep.
Are there any other issues, like bigger issues or hurdles that come with resale studies? I know we talked about the people element and maybe the discrepancies in the consistency of information, but is there anything else that comes to mind?
Well, I think if you talk discrepancy and difference in information, that comes down to a lot of how reserve study providers do business. And I equate that again. Another good analogy is you can go to Jiffy Lube and get your oil changed, or you could go to the dealer and get your oil changed. And of course, there's a different cost for those services. We would hope that if you went to the dealer, you'd get a more detailed evaluation and a good analysis and other things you didn't think of. And while you're here, let's change this little bit that might cause you problem down the road with a different cost. So I think there's a challenge with associations when they look at cost. And some of that boils down to if the state law mandates you do one every year, whether you need it or not, then we tend to just sometimes choose the cheapest. Yep. Where other states don't have a statutory requirement, maybe they choose every few years, we get a really good one and then build our own plan based on that really good analysis. So there's a little bit of that pro and con between statutory requirement, obligation, now you have to, versus what does that do to the value of the service? So I found really good associations should, and the good ones do, spend a lot of money on a really good reserve study at least once, and once within a 5 or 10 year time range. And then if you want to have somebody come out and update the chart based on what you did, that's better than hiring the person who updated the chart to not do a full analysis before we update the chart. Gotcha. So I think there's layers to that service. And I find that healthy associations tend to have a really good understanding of what's coming and how to manage that. Because the reserve study recommends, for example, at year X, you have to do this. Well, if you do some maintenance, if you do something, if you preserve or prolong that, maybe it gives you another 5 years of health. And that's fine. So the reserve study is supposed to guide that activity. And instead of being reactive, like many associations are, the reserve study can help with that proactive preservation of reduced risk. Yep.
I like that. And also, you know, every building is different too. There's some buildings that have dedicated engineers that have recommendations for certain maintenance things or tweaks that you can do to certain systems to help create more longevity in that particular, you know, system area. So of course it matters whether or not, let's say you're a 6-unit condo building, or you're a mid-rise with 250 units, or maybe you're a mega community with 650. right? So it's all kind of dependent on who you also have in your building as resources for staff, as your property management company, building engineers, facility managers, all that.
Absolutely. And just like everybody else, that if this is my primary client, I'm going to know everything about it. Where reserve study providers have hundreds and thousands of clients. They fill out charts. They don't have that level of detail and analysis. So I love the communities that have that interactive relationship where the on-site people know better than anybody how long the boiler is going to last.
Yep.
So let them tell the reserve analyst in whatever your chart says, here's how it's performing. Here's what we think. Well, let's figure that out together. That collaborative effort I find critical, and I find it to be a big challenge and a hurdle because, it's time, and time is money.
Yep. Do you find that the reserve study analysts, they are happy to work with, facility manager or someone who actually really knows to get that feedback?
I would say, generally speaking, absolutely, please and thank you, because they're running blind half the time too. We know that your building was built in this year. Well, what have you done since then?
Yep.
And they can't tell you. So we put in whatever the chart says.
Mm-hmm.
So there can be a lot of that variable between accuracy if there's not collaboration, because the reserve analyst can only go based on what they know, which is age of construction. If you're built in 2018, it's probably new. But if you told us that you replaced it in 2021, we'll update the chart and tell, hey, this is what they did.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Is there anything else? Any other kind of troublesome spots that, like issues, hurdles, problems with the reserve study?
I guess where I've come across some doozies. And I think where I find buyer beware issues with reserve studies is when you see notes in the component section, the board suggests X component is the owner's responsibility. We recommend you consult your governing documents to confirm. So when you see notes like that, then you know that the reserve analyst doesn't really believe you, but they're paying you, so they'll put it in because you told us to.
Yeah.
I've also seen reserve studies, and in Washington state, part of the law states, and I'm summarizing, you have to include components and consider the certain components, whether they fit within the 30-year lifespan or not, like siding, windows, doors, right? So I've seen reserve studies where, excuse me, and I've seen meeting minutes that say, we got a reserve study, we didn't like it, we went back to the one we got last year and had them do it. And the difference was the one they got last year deleted windows, siding, and doors. So instead of being 12% funded, we're now 108% funded. And we like that better. So here's your new reserve study.
That's silly.
So I think part of that problem with reserve studies is they're subject to the client.
Yeah.
And if the board says take it out, they'll take it out. And hopefully they put a note that says we took it out because the board told us to, and we don't, and you have to kind of read between the lines. And over time, especially me having read hundreds of reserve studies from you kind of know who's saying what and how they're saying it. But the board input with the reserve study is critical. They're the ones who say, don't forget to add the retaining wall. Don't forget to add the stuff that you don't know about. If you didn't, you wouldn't know.
Yep. So basically all boards should be getting heavily involved with the resale. It's not that you just, ask for an update or shoot, the request over. You're going to have to be able to be prepared. If you want accuracy, you're going to have to be prepared to put some time in with the reserve study company to be able to get an actual kind of true to form study.
And I would say you have to do that not every year,
but
once every few years. You have to establish a baseline.
Yep.
And maybe that comes when you switch reserve study providers. If you've had one that they say the cost to paint's 100, and when you get the contracts to paint, it's 250. All right, well, let's switch reserve study providers and let's sit down and talk with them and then get that baseline established. If you have a really good baseline reserve study, when you're not in this elevated cost cycle we're in right now, then you maybe don't need to technically, even though the law says you have to update it every year. But when we're in this elevated cost cycle, those annual updates become really important because the cost of those components can change by 30 or 50% in 1 year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, well, let's switch gears kind of to maybe the buyer mentality for those buyers who are out there. And when a buyer, an agent gets a resale certificate in Washington or in Arizona or any other state that doesn't require that, you're gathering all the documents you can, meeting minutes, financials, CC&Rs, all that sort of thing. But what specifically with the the reserve studies should buyers be focusing on?
I think the first step would be to look at whatever cost assumptions and baseline amount in the bank and compare that to the current date. So if you're looking at a reserve study today in November 9th, and it was prepared in February, that February reserve study is going to say, we assume the association has, let's say, $100,000 in the reserve account. So that would be my first place to look, is what did that reserve study assume? And is that still somewhat generally true today?
Mm-hmm.
In relation to that, you can compare the next second most important thing, in my opinion, for buyers would be to look at when do the expenses show up. So for the next 5 years, or 10, maybe 10, I try to stick to 5, 10's a bit of a stretch in condo world. In 5 years, what does the reserve study say are projected expenses? If the reserve study says windows, siding, doors, roof, elevator.
Yeah.
If the reserve study says interior hall painting, curb replacement, landscaping upgrade, electrical allowance, that's a different risk profile. So I think looking at when expenses show up and what those expenses might be in a time frame is a really good way to start to look at, as opposed to percent funded.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you could be 19% funded and have no expenses, major expenses for 20 years. You could be 19% funded and need a $5 million special assessment tomorrow.
Yeah.
So when do those expenses show up in relation to where are they starting today?
Mm-hmm. As a kind of, I guess if you're looking at that analysis, right, and you're looking at that 5-year time frame ahead as a buyer, about what time is it, 20 years or 25 years, or the bulk of those systems, at what point are those all kind of coming to head?
Oh, good question. Depends on the building and the type of construction, of course. Yep. Generally speaking, roofs are about the first major expense, roughly year 20.
Okay.
So I've kind of said, and I've kind of played around with that assumption that the sweet spot for a condo buyer is kind of year 8 to 18.
Mm-hmm.
By the time the building or the community is 8 years old, everything's stabilized. We know what it's going to cost. We've dealt with any defects. Everybody's moved in. It's occupied. And we've had a few budget cycles to figure it out. By about the year 18, we realize we don't have enough money to do roof replacements. So now we need to do adjustments, or we're looking at a cliff.
Yep.
And then once you do the roofs, then it's a pretty typical cycle. Elevators are roughly 30 years. Siding, windows, 30 to 40 to 50, depending on materials and components. So kind of the sweet spot for, generally speaking, low risk is 8 to 18 years old.
Gotcha.
And once it turns 18, do we have enough money to do roof replacement? Great. Now you have another short window to where you need to do another big expense and curve. So that expense curve definitely increases after year 20, of course, depending on the community.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of look at some of the communities now with pools, right? There's like a bigger amenity spaces, and so you have maybe it's even like theater rooms, or with the AV equipment and all that sort of thing. That those also, you have the basis of the systems, but you also have to keep in mind the bigger parts of your asset in the amenity pool, which would be coming up and maturing during that timeline too.
Absolutely. And of course, that's the difference between high rises and, 3-story wood frame walk-up construction condos.
Mm-hmm.
So where are those, when you talk condos and associations, there's the range from, 4 units up to high rises. So there are generally trends. And if you were to look at, 50 high-rise reserve studies, you would see trends in those cost cycles, just like if you looked at other, types of structures. But yeah, absolutely. And then it comes in the human factor. I've looked at a couple of reserve studies for some of our new buildings in Seattle, and one reserve analyst is recommending and including roughly $5 million in expenses to renovate interiors in the next 10 years. And the other reserve studies aren't. Well, I could probably guess that the one that is including it is probably more accurate because they will probably want to renovate their interiors within 10 years. And the other ones are just pretending they won't.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Anything else that buyers should be aware of? Or I know that you're obviously there as the number one resource to kind of go through all this and explain, especially with the different types, like you said, the wide range of what, condominium buildings are. And also depends, there's a lot of properties that have multiple outbuildings, or multiple buildings, right? So not just one tower, but multiple towers or multiple buildings. Is there anything else that you think that they should be aware of when it comes to the reserve study?
I think the high level, depending on, of course, the sophistication of the buyer and the ability to dig in, I think the key points would be, are the assumptions the reserve study made today still true at whatever point you review it? When do those expenses show up? And then, I don't know if, but I don't think, another thing I really focus on is what isn't included in the reserve study. And I'm not sure buyers would know that. They wouldn't have a way to do that evaluation. So I think that the biggest factor for me with buyers would be, what are the assumptions made in the study at the time? Where are they today? And when do those expenses show up? So if you're looking at buying a condo and you're going to live there for 5 years, what are those expenses in that 5-year window? That helps with your gauge of what else might I have to pay for? And if you're planning on holding for 5, look at 10, because when you go to sell, the next buyer will be looking at the next 5.
That's a good point, looking ahead. So, and I guess that kind of, again, moves us into the next one of, why it's important to have these it's important to have these reserve studies because they actually do feed into the overall value of the property too. They translate in a way that, and I know that sometimes, we get pushback or we see condo that has dues maybe over $1 a square foot, and we're like, wow, those dues are pretty pricey. What does that all include? But higher due amounts due to maybe HOAs trying to be proactive in building in these reserve study fees, to feed the reserves for these different items, sometimes is the healthiest way. And so I sometimes look at, so what if the HOA dues are higher? Yes, but maybe, the way that the board is running is that they're trying to maximize the contribution of reserves so that they're hedging any future special assessment. And so is that an accurate way, or how do you, I guess, when you're looking at a resale certificate package, how do you decipher that might be the motivation?
That's a really great summary. I did a review the other day, and the buyer felt the dues were really high, and their dues were $900 a month. And in my data, King County right now is, I don't know, 530, 540-ish. So the dues were high. They felt high. I said, have you looked at other condos? Yeah, these seemed higher than other, price points and okay, well, let's look at the stuff I've put together. So I take resale certificate data and plug it into templates I've built to help get that consistency and that comparison. Well, plugging in that data, they were putting almost 50% of their budget to the reserve account, which is incredibly high. I think in my data, median's about 25% of the budget going to reserves. And the reserve contribution is the most elective. That's what boards can choose. You can't choose your utility cost. You can kind of choose insurance a little bit, but the reserve contribution is the choice.
Yep.
So if we choose to have high dues, we're choosing to pay less in a special assessment in the future, is usually what, and well, that's often what I can flesh out.
Yep.
Sometimes associations that are putting a lot away to reserves, it's because they're so far behind. That's the only way they can catch up, in addition to doing special assessments. So I think the reserve contribution is a reflection of choice. And some buyers care most about how much will I have to pay for.
Yep.
Some buyers care most about, will they take care of it? And I don't care what it costs. So there's a different buyer perspective and different buyer intent, but the illustration of the association to a buyer is, here's what the reserve study recommends, here's what we choose. And sometimes that's really impactful. If the reserve study says we recommend you contribute baseline 100 grand and you're putting aside 10, well, then we can tell a buyer your risk is really high. They're choosing not to fund it. They're choosing to pay for it in other ways.
Yeah.
We can say the one that's funding at 50%, they're looking at hedging their risk in the future and reducing the risk of paying outside of that dues structure. And then some communities, especially older ones, you kind of reach that tipping point where you can't really raise the dues too much more and still be competitive.
Yep.
So that reserve contribution portion of the budget can be skewed by that factor.
Yeah.
If we're putting 40% aside and we can't have dues at $1,200 a month if the one across the street's at $4. So it kind of plays into all those factors, but I feel the reserve contribution that they're actually doing is very reflective of the association's mentality. How do we choose to exist? How do we choose to proceed?
Yep. And maybe also the mindset of the homeowners and where maybe they see themselves, right? So if they're looking more long-term, they're going to be looking definitely at maybe stacking their reserves a little bit differently than those that are more short-term, where they're looking at kind of like their short-term cash flow that's going out every month. So,
and if it's investor owned, if it's a rental community, if it's not, if it's a high rise that's fairly insulated, if there's a lot of variables that go into that. But I look a lot at the reserve contribution as a reflection of the association. So when buyers want to know, well, what will they do in the future? Which everybody asks. Yeah. We don't know. But what we can see is historically, here's what they have done. If they historically have funded at 90% below baseline, well, they probably aren't going to change tomorrow.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Unless you get on the board and change it yourself, which is always an option.
Yep. Did you want to talk any more about like the value or like the perceived value in the market when you have kind of reserve studies and balances and stuff that are off?
Ooh, yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. I think the reserve study can significantly negatively impact a community. At the same time, it can positively impact. And I look at that from a resale perspective. And another good analogy is if you're going to buy a condo or a vehicle, you want a Carfax report. You want to take it to a mechanic and have them look under the hood and tell you, based on how old this vehicle is, you need new brakes, a new engine, a new carburetor, or not. So the reserve study from that angle can tell the story. And good reserve studies tell a buyer why we're so great. Look at all these things we've done. Look at our history and our next 5 years. And frustrating reserve studies make you go figure that out yourself, which many buyers can't. Yeah. So I feel, again, that comes back to a little bit of collaboration. The board could go a long way for resale and perceived value of a community if, for example, in our annual meeting, the board president commented on the reserve study. The reserve study suggests we do this, 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 and this. We are electing to do this because it's better for us, and here's why we're so great and why that's all okay. So having that collaborative, cohesive, connect the dots between documents is really impactful for buyers. And I feel that's where sellers can gain, if not retain, if not increase sale value and resale value, is in telling and demonstrating to purchasers how great you are. And the reserve study is a really critical tool for that, to say, here's how, look at all the great stuff we've done. Yep.
I think that's great. And I do see that myself kind of out there, and even in the building that I'm in, it's just, you have to kind of pay attention to the reserve study for sure. And it's kind of like a guiding light, I guess.
And we know what happens when you get a bad one.
Yep, definitely.
And next year we get a good one, and now we have to increase our contribution by 30% because we left out $10-20 million worth of stuff that wasn't in the first one. It can be impactful significantly.
Yeah, definitely. I don't want to put you on blast here and you don't have to answer, but do you have maybe your top two reserve study companies that you think that they're pretty thorough and you consistently see their reports as maybe standing out among the rest?
I would say in Washington, RCL does a really good job, and Reserve Consultants LLC.
Gotcha.
One reason I like them is they automatically calculate or include in their assumptions sales tax. So they tend to be 10% more accurate on cost assumptions than others who don't. They tend to include a lot of detail and notes, which is incredibly helpful to a buyer to say, for me to advise a buyer is, look, yeah, they say you're supposed to paint, but you did it last year. And they say, if detail. So I like RCL for that. I also feel that over time, I've seen, in addition to RCL, I've seen Samdahl and Associates, Jeff Samdahl's, his studies be pretty accurate comparatively.
Yep.
And where I see that reflected is when an association switches providers. Anytime you switch providers for anything, you're likely to see a cost adjustment because somebody's going to look at it differently.
Gotcha.
When I see RCL or Samdahl come in after another provider, then I see a big shift in how they calculate all those cost obligations, which I view as a good thing. Instead of pretending you don't have all this stuff, here, we're going to identify it for you. So I would say those two in Washington are probably my favorite. RDH also does really good technical levels of detail. Their studies are a little hard to interpret. They're not quite as pretty or easy to read. And they're probably, them and Morrison Hershfield in Oregon are probably the two best down there to be accurate from a costing and building science analysis perspective.
Yeah.
But I think the key to a good reserve analyst and a good reserve study, it has to be collaborative. And they'll tell you that too. They say, we can't do your study unless you answer some of our questions. So it has to go both ways. But I would say those two tend to be, based on what I've seen over time, be not fired as often, not as wrong as everybody else, not as, people aren't as horrified by the results. And I see them to be pretty consistent over time.
Got it. What have you, in working kind of in the different states, is there anything that is surprising you about, other state laws when it comes to condos and like disclosures?
Well, I guess one difference is Washington does have a statutory requirement for resale. And I know for sure Oregon doesn't, or Arizona doesn't.
Yep.
So your requirement for your ability to evaluate a condo is more dependent on your contract as opposed to whatever the state says. On the flip side of that, in Washington, you have to pay for all that information. In Oregon, and I'm assuming in Arizona, a lot of it's just free. You just go on the website and download the budget and download the details.
You end up hounding a million people to try to get all the accurate information because they don't legally have to provide it to you.
Correct. Yep. So I'm finding the use of a checklist to be exponentially valuable in states that don't have a statutory requirement. And you and I have talked about a little bit of this. So going forward, your recommended contractual offers will include, here's a list of what we need to be able to fully evaluate. And that does somewhat mirror the Washington state law because the data required is what we want: history of budget and reserve study and current financials, the important pieces. So I think going forward in states that don't have statutory requirements, a really clear, seriously, just a checklist of give us these documents as part of the contract would make a huge difference for buyers being able to better evaluate what they're getting into.
Yeah, I like that. Definitely. It's so funny just working in different states and the different laws, and in condo specifically being such a condo heavy specialist, walking in a world that, is a little bit more lax. You definitely have to kind of come up with your own process to protect yourself and your buyer, to make sure that you know that, you know, they're making the right decision. And some people in the industry, they just don't, you know, understand that because they don't see, I guess I would probably assume Washington is probably one of the most strict states, being that it is a statutory requirement. You know, you have all that information that you can go through and decipher whether or not the building is sound or not, or what to expect, you should say, for future. So,
and I would say although just like with other laws, it's only as good as the enforcement ability. So yes, Washington state has a law. Out of the last hundreds I've done, I think I would say the compliance with the entire state law is less than 1%.
Yeah. We're always battling that up here too.
And it's a joke. I mean, right? It's so
Yeah,
and the analogy I use all the time is, well, the law says you have to give us this stuff. You're right. And the law says I'm not supposed to speed.
Yeah.
I go out the door and speed every day. Okay, great.
Unless it's being strictly enforced, right?
If there's no enforcement or no consequences. So association management companies who produce them, they're free of liability for not being correct. There's no way to get them to comply. You know, you're just subject to that. So I see pros and cons, a statutory requirement. The downside is there's no compliance obligation. Yeah, the law, but great. No one does it anyway. What's the point?
Yeah.
As opposed to a contract that maybe dictates the seller provides something more clearly, specifically. Although, you know, you still fight that battle. You can't make people give you stuff.
Yeah. And especially things they don't have to, and how that's handled, right?
Sure. And with condos, it's exacerbated by layers of people required to give you that data.
Yep.
Ideally, the seller, who's a member of the association, would have stuff.
You think, but if, let's say, meeting minutes weren't being taken and they were just doing everything in a room without documenting, you know, important conversations, and they just don't have that information, you know,
you can't make it up. You can't force them to give it to you. No.
Yeah. Interesting. Good. Well, thank you. I think that we covered resale, or gosh, I keep doing that. Reserve studies. It's a part of the resale.
It is. Yes.
But we covered them pretty extensively. And again, I just appreciate your wealth of knowledge and you agreeing to come on here. Again, we'll have to do another one and another topic of some sort, maybe in the next couple months after the holidays. I'm sure we'll find something to talk about.
Yeah, we'll roll into 24 with some new interesting what's happening now. There's always change, right? There's something happening every day.
Yes, there is.
Well, thanks for having me. Great to chat with you as always.
You bet. All right. Well, thank you. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. Sweet. See you later.
Bye, Ashley.